Welcome back to a brand new video, folks. Today, I am bringing you the Strafe Impale Demon Hunter. This is the best build in the game to start your Season 27. This build is phenomenal for getting Paragon levels, but first, let's dig into some of the pros and cons about this build because it is not great for everything. Let's start with some of the cons. The first one is you're really going to struggle with this build if you're trying to do Torment 16 content. This includes bounties and key farming. The next one is you are going to struggle in lower greater rifts. Now that shouldn't be an issue because with this build the point is to quickly do high level greater rifts. Another con is that this build is not going to work after the season ends, so if you're interested in playing this character non-season, it's not going to work anymore. The second the season ends, you are going to lose the power from the Angelic Crucible that makes this build work. And the last con, the discipline management is a little bit tedious, but we have ways to work around that we'll get into. Okay, for some of the pros, the build is very easy to play. It's very casual to play, it's a spin to win build, and it's a lot of fun. It's also a very mobile build. You're going to be able to move around a lot while you're dealing damage, so it's great for avoiding damage. You also have fairly decent damage mitigation with your gear. We use items that reduce the damage that we take by quite a significant amount. And the last pro is that this build is very good for group RGK. So if you want to play in a group and you want to be a Rift Guardian killer, this is a good build for you. There are some tweaks that you'll have to make, and there's a perfect guide for that on Maxroll about how you should gear. But for the sake of this build, we're going to focus on how to use this for its primary purpose, which for most people is farming Paragon levels. Let's go ahead and hop into the gear. We are going to benefit from the 6-piece Shadow set. So, in order for this to work, you have to at least have 5 pieces and a Ring of Royal Grandeur in the cube. This helm has all the stats that you're going to want. You're going to want Dexterity, you're going to want Crit Hit Chance, and you're going to want Impale damage. Moving on to the shoulders, we use the Mantle of Channeling. This is great for both damage mitigation and adding damage. For the Mantle of Channeling, you are going to want the Dex, you are going to want the Vitality, the area damage, and the cooldown reduction. Now, you only need a specific percentage of cooldown reduction with this build, so if you are getting your cooldown somewhere else, it is okay to not roll cooldown on the shoulders. A good alternative to cooldown is resource cost reduction, especially when you get to the higher Paragons and you start to use the Captain Crimson set. Moving on to the amulet, we are going to use Squirt's Necklace. Now I do not have an ancient roll, so I cannot augment this piece, but these are the perfect stats that you want to roll. You want that fire damage, and then you want that trifecta, the crit hit chance, the socket, and the crit hit damage. Moving on to the gloves. I got a phenomenal primal roll on these, and it was so lucky, because these are exactly the stats that I want. Now, if you are going to be solo pushing with this build, it's not something I necessarily recommend with this build. It's really better for, like, speed Paragon farming. But if you are going to push with this build, I recommend rolling the Dexterity off and going for area damage. Moving on to the chest piece. These are the stats you want. Once again, you want that Dexterity, Vitality, all resist, and you want to augment it and get the 3 sockets. If you happen to roll armor on this, or percent life as opposed to all resist, you can get away with that for a while, so don't worry too much if it's not perfect. Moving on to the bracers. These are the correct rolls. You want that fire damage, you want Dexterity, Vitality, and crit hit chance on your bracers. We're going to be using the Guardian's bracers, especially at the lower Paragon levels. Now when you get to roughly Paragon 2000, you can switch over to the Captain Crimson set, but for the purpose of this guide, I wanted to cover the Guardian set because I think that most people looking up a guide are probably just getting started this season or are probably not at Paragon 2000 yet. That brings us over to the belt, and we're using the Guardians to benefit from the 3-piece set because we are using the Ring of Royal Grandeur. This adds substantial amounts of Dexterity and Vitality to your character. The rolls on this belt are what you want. You want that Dexterity, you want that Vitality, you want the all resist, and you want the life percentage. Once again, if you happen to roll armor instead of all resist or percent life, it's not the end of the world, but try to over time optimize your gear and go for these specific rolls. We're going to be using the focus and restraint combination. This adds substantial amounts of damage. The rolls on this are close to what you want. I would say if you could get that Dexterity to roll average damage instead, it's probably a little stronger. Moving over to my restraint. Once again, you want the same rolls that you get on the focus. You're ideally going to want that average damage, crit hit chance, crit hit damage, and a socket. Now mine's not perfect, but I did get a primal roll, and I do benefit from that additional cooldown reduction when I'm actually using the Captain Crimson variant of this build. Moving on to the legs, these are the stats that you want. You want that Dexterity, Vitality, All Resist, and you want those sockets. Moving on to the boots, these are the stats that you're going to want as well. Dexterity, Vitality, All Resist, and especially Impale damage. That is so important to make sure that where you can roll that Impale damage, that you are rolling it, because that is what we're doing with this build. We are throwing out Impales crazy fast. Moving on to the weapon, and this is one of the biggest benefits to playing this build, it is too easy to get a Primal Carla's point. How you're going to want to do that is you are going to want to go to the blacksmith and craft level 70 yellow daggers. You are then going to go to the cube and use recipe number 3 to convert a rare item into a legendary item. There are only 2 rolls that you can possibly get when upgrading a yellow dagger, either Carla's Point or Lord Greenstone's. If you roll enough of these, you're eventually just bound to get a primal. It probably costed me about 10,000 or so of the Arcane Dust, reusable parts, and Veiled Crystals to finally roll a primal. Now, one thing I will say is that when it comes to the cooldown on this build does not require a substantial amount of cooldown. We'll get to that later about exactly how much you need, but if you happen to roll Vitality on this as opposed to the cooldown, it is not the end of the world. And lastly, we're going to be using the Holy Point shot. This is so important. It's going to make you throw additional impales out, so instead of throwing 1, you're going to throw out 3. This is absolutely necessary for the build. This item is also difficult to roll particularly well, and so for this reason, I recommend using your Angelic Crucible on the Holy Point shot because getting a Primal Carla's Point is a lot easier. And on top of that, rolling the correct stats on the Holy Point shot is very difficult. So by using those Angelic Crucibles, you can use them over and over and over again until you finally get the optimal stats. These are the stats that you want. Okay, moving into the gems that we use for this build. We are going to start with a Bane of the Trapped. This is very common in almost all builds. Bane of the Trapped adds substantial damage, and it is very easy to put a movement impairing effect on your enemies. We're also going to be using the Taeguk, and the reason for this is that we are spinning the entire time, and therefore we are channeling by using Strafe. Therefore, 10 stacks of Taeguk are almost up permanently. This adds both a lot of damage and a lot of damage mitigation for our character. Now lastly, we're going to be using the Zestone of Vengeance. This is kind of a funny choice because I find with this build, you want to be a little closer to your enemies because you want all 3 knives hitting them as opposed to just 1 or 2 if you're far away because the spread gets a little too large. However, one thing that I will say is that the Zestone of Vengeance is actually a lot better than it reads. I'll be making a whole video on the Zestone of Vengeance and how it actually works as opposed to how it reads and why it's probably better than you think. Let's move on over to the cube. First, we're going to be using a Dawn. This is mandatory. You need Vengeance up permanently. It is very easy to keep Vengeance up permanently because it does not take that much cooldown because we're using the Dawn in the cube. This is going to add substantial damage and substantial damage mitigation. If you do not have permanent Vengeance up, you are going to die. Next up is Wraps of Clarity. These are essential. You are going to die constantly if you do not have this item in your cube. Now it is possible to wear this item as well. If you're going with the Captain Crimson variant, I have seen people equip the Wraps of Clarity and actually do the Mantle of Channeling in the cube instead. And for the ring slot, of course we need the Ring of Royal Grandeur so that we can get away with using 5 pieces of the Shadow set and 2 pieces of the Guardian set, or the Captain Crimson set, depending on which variants you're going to make. Let's go ahead and get into the skills that we use on this build. On our left click, we're going to be using Bolas and Freezing Strike. Now, there is an alternative choice to this. If you are struggling with Discipline, it is not that bad to go ahead and use the Bolas with Bitter Pill. This will help you spam Strafe more. However, the Freezing Strike Bolas are very nice, and the reason for this is that you're shooting 3 of them out, and it is very easy to connect with a target. This is going to help keep up the Focus and Restraint combo as much as possible, and it's also going to help you keep up those Wraps of Clarity. On our right click, we're going to be using Strafe with Drifting Shadow. This is essential because this is going to help us move much faster while we're strafing. We do not want to be sluggishly going through these rifts. The point of this build is to get through them quickly, and this is going to be essential. Next up is Impale with Chemical Burn. Now there are alternative choices. Some people like to use Overpenetration because the Impale will now pierce its target. However, one thing that I will say is that the Shadow set benefits more when you deal damage to the first target that you hit. And therefore, when this penetrates and goes through, the remainder of the damage that's hitting the additional enemies is actually substantially lower. On top of that, with the chemical burn, you kind of get a double bonus from the Shadow set. There's a 75,000% damage increase on your Impale for the first target that you're hitting, and the chemical burn effect that burns for 500% damage over 2 seconds also benefits from that 75,000% damage boost. Next up is Smokescreen with Special Recipe. You're going to want to keep the discipline cost down when you are using Smokescreen. This build is not fantastic at keeping your discipline up, and so you're going to want to save as much as you can whenever you can. Shadow Power Glide is our next skill. You use this once at the start of the rift, and you don't have to touch it again. With the Shadow set, it's going to stay up permanently, and you're going to gain the effect of all runes. Because of this, it is not particularly important which rune you pick on your Shadow Power. It's going to make you look different when you use it, so dealer's choice. And last up is Vengeance Darkheart. We want this Darkheart because it is fantastic for damage mitigation. Vengeance is pretty standard on most builds, especially when we can keep it up permanently with that Dawn in the Cube. There is a lot of debate when it comes to the passive skills for this build. There are a lot of different choices you can take. Demon Hunters have phenomenal passive abilities. I'm just going to dive in and tell you what I take, and then if you find that something works better for you, go for it. First off is the Tactical Advantage, and I would say that the vast majority of players are using this. This is going to help us move faster so we can clear those greater rifts much quicker. Thrill of the Hunt is not as common in all builds. I like to use it because it allows Bane of the Trapped to permanently gain its damage increase against everything that we're hitting because now we're slowing them. We don't have to be right up in their face to gain the effect from the Bane of the Trapped that creates that aura around you that slows the enemies that are near you. Now you can be further away and still benefit from that Bane of the Trapped damage. Ambush is great. It just deals substantial damage to enemies while they're at full health. So that first hit that you're taking on those enemies is going to do a lot of damage and put you really far ahead. Now the last one that I use is Blood Vengeance. And I will say that most builds probably aren't using this. Most players that I see are not using the Blood Vengeance. A lot of them are opting to take some kind of damage skill instead, such as Coal of the Weak, or Steady Aim. But having said that, I do recommend Blood Vengeance, or at least giving it a try, especially if you are struggling with Discipline. This is going to give you Hatred and Discipline back every time you take a health globe. Using this passive is going to make the build less tedious to play. One of the most annoying parts of the build is running out of discipline and feeling like you're just moving so slow because you cannot be using your smoke screen. This is going to help with that. I highly recommend at least giving it a try before you give it up for something that deals more damage. Okay, before we get into a greater rift and I show you this build, I'm going to go over some tips and tricks while you're playing this build so that you can optimize your play. Okay, the first tip is while you're strafing, throw out impales manually. The reason for this is that there is an internal cooldown on that impale throw while you're strafing. You can actually sneak in additional impales between that internal cooldown. The next one, this is especially important for people who are used to playing the Gears of the Dreadland set. You do not want to be spamming Bola every second while you're strafing. That is a Gears of the Dreadland thing. We don't need to keep up stacks like we do in Gears of the Dreadland. The only thing that we need to do is shoot off a bullet every 5 seconds, make sure it connects with an enemy. This is going to proc the focus and restraint combo, or at least half of it. The other half is going to be up effectively permanently because the impales that you're automatically throwing are going to proc one of those 2 rings. Okay, the next one. Like we had talked about earlier, cooldown reduction is essential because you need to have permanent uptime on your Vengeance. This requires 37% on your character stat sheet. If you cannot get that through your gear, I recommend using the Enchantress because she has the passive ability to give you additional cooldown reduction. The next tip is if you want to be a Rift Guardian killer, you're going to want to try to sneak in maybe a little attack speed on your gear. If you want to be a speed farmer and you want to go through these higher level greater rifts really quickly, you might want to focus instead on stacking a little more area damage as opposed to that attack speed. Now the final tip is if you happen to have a potion of mutilation, which I don't, but if you do, it's one of those potions that has a special effect with it, and when you use it, it gives you a lot of additional life per kill. If we look at the Shadow Power ability, life per hit is increased by 25% of your life per kill. The Potion of Mutilation is going to give you a ton of life per kill. If you use that potion and then proceed to use Shadow Power, it's going to snapshot your life per kill at the moment that you would use the potion, and therefore your life per hit is going to go substantially up. This is going to help you survive really well. Okay, let's go ahead and get into some gameplay. I'm going to rock a GR 118. That's kind of the level that I've liked to do lately. I find that I get them done typically in about 2.5 minutes. Whatever level you're doing, make sure that it is high enough so that you are keeping your hatred up. You are going to struggle in lower greater rifts and Torment 16 content because you're going to kill everything in one shot. The way that this build works is that you gain hatred back when you hit the same enemy twice. Let's go ahead and dive right in. Alrighty guys, that's going to wrap it up. I hope that you enjoyed the build and I hope that you give it a shot. There has never been a better opportunity to solo farm Paragon levels that I can remember in this entire game. If you're interested in being a competitive player this season, I cannot recommend this build enough. Go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know if you have any questions about this build. Are you struggling to keep up hatred? Is discipline management difficult? If you need any tips or tricks, please go ahead and just post down below and I'd be happy to help. Alrighty folks, I can't thank you enough for tuning into another video. I really appreciate your time and appreciate you coming by to watch this video. We'll catch you on the next one, and thanks for watching.